Good afternoon and welcome. It is not every day that we have the highest ranking Black woman in the U.S. Congress in the House. Come on. My name is Lorraine Bishop, and I'm in my second year here at CUNY School of Law, where I serve as academic chair of CUNY Law's Black Law Student Association, and was recently selected as a 2023 Sorensen Center Fellow. On behalf of our Dean, Sutha Sethi, Sorensen Center Founding Director Camille Massey, Sorensen Center Board Chair Gillian Sorensen, as well as our junior board chairs Christina Das and Scott Kennedy, who is joining us on Zoom all the way from California. Hi, Scott. It is my honor to welcome you. It is wonderful to see many and new familiar faces in the crowd, including our partners at Global Kids and Hunter College. Before I introduce the two civil rights icons today, Congresswoman Lee and Carol Jenkins, let me say thank you to all who co-sponsored today's event. In addition to BALSA, we are well represented with the Women of Color Coalition, the Latin American Law Student Association, International Law Society, CUNY Law Review, If, When, How, Outlaws, CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium, and Formerly Incarcerated Law Students Advisory Association. During spring break, we are happy to see the great turnout in the room and on Zoom as we celebrate Women's History Month, and notably, it is the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. Congresswoman Barbara Lee remains to this day a fierce critic of the Iraq War. She was the only member of Congress to vote against the authorization of force following the September 11th attack, and continues to pursue repeal of this authorization. Representative Lee is a member of the Appropriations Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee of State and Foreign Operations. Who better to speak at the Sorensen Center for International Peace and Justice, named after Ted Sorensen, who is also an outspoken critic of the Iraq War, than Barbara Lee. She has worked for decades to advance international peace and diplomacy, racial justice, LGBT plus rights, economic justice, reproductive rights, and the abolition of the death penalty. I will now turn it over to the amazing Carol Jenkins, an esteemed journalist, host of CUNY TV's Black America, and the woman who has recently led the fight to amend the U.S. Constitution to include equal rights based on sex. Thank you, Carol. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and thank you for all of the organizations who are represented here today. It's quite amazing, and it is spring break. It's hard to say spring, but we're actually there, right? Spring break. To Camille Massey, to Gillian Sorensen, and to this wonderful center dedicated, Congresswoman Lee, to peace, which is why we are also thrilled that you are here with us today. 20 years. Now, the one thing I do want to suggest, because we know that the Congresswoman is on, they're in session, and, you know, she is here with us and may have to leave. When we were in the back, she was still saving us all, you know, getting us out of some jam or another. So we thank you for that. But there is a documentary that is accessible on YouTube and Amazon. It's called Barbara Lee Speaking Truth to Power. It is fantastic if you want the full story of how this woman got to be sitting here with us, a magnificent career in the House of Representatives and now running for Senate. Please do watch the film. 20 years. You were... And when I saw in the film the deliberation that went into that decision, it was not one of those, oh no, this is wrong, I'm not voting for it. Talk with us a little bit about what you went through to come to that decision to say no. And then when you discovered that you were the only one.
First, thank you, Carol. Is this on? Can you hear me? Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you and to share this conversation. I wish I could stay longer, but yes, I do have a day job. And I do have to get back to Washington. But Mrs. Sorensen, thank you so much. It's really an honor to meet you. And to all of you, it's really wonderful. First of all, the Sorensen Center for International Peace and Justice. I wrote a book and it was released in 2008, and it was called Renegade for Peace and Justice. So this is my life. And going back to September 11th, 2001, it was, as you know, and especially here in New York, a horrific day. It was a day still we're dealing with, the families, friends, the community, in terms of what happened. And the world will never be the same, and the country, the United States, will never be the same as a result of that. My chief of staff, Sandre Swanson, his cousin, who I knew well, was a flight attendant on Flight 93. And so you can imagine, and I was sitting in the Capitol that morning and had to evacuate. We were told that a plane could be coming in. And so you can imagine how personal this was for me. And so the fear, the anger, the sorrow, the grief, it wasn't distant. It was real. It was personal, and it was also real in terms of the numbers of lives that were lost, the tragedy that had occurred, knowing what the impact was going to be on the first responders. I mean, so you all know, being in here, what that meant. And so I'm setting the stage for that because I was one who wanted to make sure we did something, respond, but not in a way that was going to lead to forever wars and that it would spiral out of control on any front. Because I knew then that we had to, we could not pass an authorization, AUMF, to use force that was 60 words, that was overly broad, that set the stage for forever wars. And when I read that and I tried to speak to the Democratic caucus about it, I said, look, you know, we are giving away our constitutional responsibility, not only to George Bush, but to any subsequent president. We don't know what we're doing. This was 3 days after the horrific attacks. I said, let's take some time. Let's understand what our appropriate response should be. Now, my dad, Lieutenant Colonel in the military, retired. He was in World War II and Korea. And he called me after I voted no, and he said that was the right vote. You do not send our troops into harm's way. You do not give away that authority to any president. I mean, it's your constitutional responsibility to debate and decide when to use force and when not to use force. So I took a deep breath after he called me. But having said that,
you were under police security surveillance for quite some time.
Death threats, and I'll never forget there were some people, I don't know who they were, who would call my house and on a landline and leave and shot gunshots into the voicemail. It was a mean period for me. It was hostile. People were angry. They called me a traitor. Actually, a person ran against me in the primary, and she came to New York in a Veterans Day parade and wrote with Rudy Giuliani, at the head of the parade, holding a sign with me smiling, the World Trade Towers in the background, saying Barbara Lee hates America. And it was like, you know, so it was this kind of trauma that I had to deal with, and still, because it was very painful, because I knew why I voted no, and now everybody else knows and understands that authorization has been used in 19 countries over 40 times with no connection to 9/11 at all. So yes, sometimes you just have to stand and wait until everybody else catches up with you and take those kinds of risks. And
right, it sometimes takes 20 years before people catch up. Your statement on that, on March 19th, you wrote, 20 years ago today, the United States invaded Iraq. This reckless and unsubstantiated war cost hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. $2.9 trillion to be exact.
Let me clarify something. The one where I was the only one to vote against the authorization was 9/11, 3 days after 9/11. The Iraq authorization had the 9/11 embedded in it. It was written in it as a reference, and that was the next year. And so there were a couple of, probably about 133 no votes on Iraq. But let me tell you what happened during that period. We knew, most of us, I mean, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so we have these classified briefings, what have you. We knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so what happened was the president came forward with an authorization, and I said, wait a minute. It's based on weapons of the lies, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That's not the case. I said, minimally, we should at least let the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, complete its inspections. Let us make public the findings of the IAEA before we rush to pass another authorization. Well, I offered an amendment to that effect on the floor, and I got 72 votes for that amendment. Now, had my amendment passed, we never would have, I mean, you know, the president probably would have vetoed it, but that set the stage for others to keep going. So fast forward till recently, I have introduced legislation to repeal that and the 2001 over and over and over again. And I've gotten it passed through the House over and over and over again. This last year, the repeal of Iraq got 49 Republican votes. So it's bipartisan to do this. So I finally got it to the Senate, talked to Senator Kaine, and Senator Kaine took it up in the Senate. And 3 weeks ago, I went over to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as they debated my repeal, which was now Senator Kaine's in the Senate, and it passed on a bipartisan basis. Passed. Right. Chairman Menendez chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, so now it's going to the floor.
The full floor.
Full floor. And finally, I'll just say, when I passed it last year, President Biden, before it got off of the floor of the House, he issued a SAP, a Statement of Administration Policy, that he would sign that repeal if it got to his desk. So now we have to start over in the House, but I have Chip Roy and some of the MAGA folks supporting it. But I don't know how Kevin is going to navigate this, but we're going to stay at it until we get it past the House again, then it will go to the president.
You love the way Barbara Lee refers to the Speaker of the House as Kevin. What we don't know, we don't know what Kevin is going to do. But to my point of when you took that stand, you had just come into Congress recently, you know. I mean, but what most people
in 98.
98.
25 years.
I know. Right. Congratulations for 25 years. But then people perceived you as being brand new in the Congress. But your life story, that you were tutored by Shirley Chisholm, Ron Dellums, the Black Panther Party. And so you had spent how many years as Ron Dellums' chief of staff in Congress? So you knew where everything was. You knew where the ladies' rooms were, right?
I hit the ground running. I was Ron, and there were very few black women on the Hill as chief of staffs. Ron asked me to head up his office. This is after I finished graduate school at UC Berkeley. And I did. And Ron ultimately, and he came to Congress based on a peace agenda. He was very much against the Vietnam War. And in fact, he beat an incumbent who was for the war. And so our office, and my leading the office, was always about looking for amendments, laws, bills, funding priorities that reflected a peace and justice agenda. And Ron became chair of the Armed Services Committee. The only African-American chair that the Armed Services Committee has ever had. Now, let me tell you this quick story. Ron was such a respectful member, respecting different points of views, until he incorporated as chair amendments from Republicans and Democrats that seemed reasonable. But he always voted against his own bill. And you know why? Because the funding for the defense and the Pentagon continues to this day to be excessive, and I'm trying to cut it by $100 billion, which wouldn't even touch our national security or our troops. We need to invest more in our troops and in, taxpayer dollars for domestic priorities. But having said that, Ron was really a champion for peace and justice, and he taught me a lot about how to stand on principle, but how to be respectful of other people's ideas, but don't cave on something that is that important in terms of a position that reflects what has to be done in this country if we're really going to achieve peace and justice.
Exactly. And one of the things that many of your supporters say is that they know that you know what it's like not to have a lot of money, to have to rely on a government to help you. And you actually, when you had 2 small children. You got your undergraduate degree from Mills, your graduate degree from Berkeley. And I love the story in the film you'll see where her 2 sons had to go to school with her because she couldn't afford childcare. And I love the fact that you all had to take statistics twice because you flunked it the first time. Is that?
Yeah, and one of the issues still is child care. And in my Senate campaign, I'm talking about child care. Because can you imagine, here I'm on public assistance, on food stamps, trying to get an education, working as a community worker with the Black Panther Party, taking care of these little boys, and I couldn't afford child care. And so I had to take them to class with me and it was really something. And I got a C, and I don't like getting C's in statistics, so I took it over again and got a B. And my kids sat through semesters of statistics.
Right.
But I share that because it's so important. Here we are, fast forward. They're my age now, my kids,
right.
And we're still dealing with child care. I mean, it's kind of like how do families afford child care, especially single moms who are just barely making it, people who work in the care economy barely making it on $15 or less an hour with no benefits. I mean, come on.
Right, I want to talk a little bit about poverty with you, since you're looking for the solutions to it. We had something called the child tax credit, which lifted, almost 6 million children out of poverty. You are now counting the unhoused people in this country, and that figure is now over 500,000 people who have no homes whatsoever. Never mind the dilapidated ones. How are we going to address it? Matthew Desmond, who wrote Evicted and now has a new book out on poverty, says that we have got to be poverty abolitionists. It has got to be so horrible, such a negative thing that we have to do away with it. We're not there yet. People are fine with ignoring people who are starving, who have no roofs over their heads.
Yeah, inequality is growing, and it's becoming normalized in this country, and you see it on the streets all over the country with people being unhoused, primarily in a lot of areas because they were evicted. So we have to deal with eviction first, and how to make sure people have a place to live where they're not just evicted because of landlords trying to, and I'm not talking about small landlords, but I'm talking about these big developers, what's happening. But when you look at poverty, and I work very closely with Bishop Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, there are literally 140 million people living below the poverty line here in the United States. 20 million of them in California, one paycheck away from falling below the poverty line. Food insecurity in California, in the Central Valley, some of the highest in the country. This is a moral disgrace. It's a shame and disgrace, and it has a lot to do with the budget. And you see what's taking place now. I mean, during the height of the pandemic, we did the child tax credit. We provided eviction moratoriums. We expanded unemployment compensation, put more money in our unemployment checks. And we did a lot to help people. Those investments should be sustained and more, because we see they worked during COVID. Once we got too many people died and livelihoods were, destroyed during COVID because of, who didn't take it on early on. But these investments should not be repealed. Like now what we're dealing with is we added more for SNAP benefits. Now that's about to expire. Okay, these people are going to fall way back under. And during that period, you saw people in line in cars who were middle income waiting for food boxes.
Isn't there one line in Kentucky that was a 9-hour wait?
Yeah, that's
it was, and for food. And yes, and so now the SNAP, the food benefits are being cut back. You're fighting to get that back. At the same time, let's just talk about a bank, in your state, where many people think, even though everybody keeps saying it wasn't a bailout, but it seemed to many people to be a bailout.
Well, perception is everything, first of all. And it does look like a bailout, but it wasn't. I was on the Financial Services Committee with Chairwoman Maxine Waters for 10 years, 11 years, till I went to the Appropriations Committee. But a couple of things. So far, the bailout, which it wasn't really a bailout, these banks were saved through the FDIC, through fees that banks pay to the FDIC for moments like this. Now, the negative impact and the ripple effect is another thing in terms of in retirement security, in terms of the stock market going up and down, and for seniors who have accounts that they rely on in terms of investment accounts. So it did have and it does have a ripple effect, but it wasn't considered a bailout. But when you look at it, it's like, come on, we have the SNAP benefits, and low-income people have to worry about losing some food and becoming food insecure versus the very wealthy, the CEOs and the shareholders, they were asleep at the wheel. But finally, I'll just say we need to go back and reinstitute Glass-Steagall, but also the Dodd-Frank provisions that the Donald Trump administration repealed. We need to reinstitute those, and they need some guardrails, at least minimally, to be able to get back on solid economic footing.
Exactly. And we know that you voted against that weakening as well. So 20 years since your historic vote and the war, 5 years since another tragedy in this country, the Parkland shooting. If you could address for us all how we grapple with this issue of guns now being the deadliest weapon against our children, the biggest cause of death of children in America, guns.
Again, Americans are becoming numb to all of these terrible tragedies related to gun violence. And a couple of things. We've passed some modest gun safety measures, and the president has issued executive orders such as, waiting periods. But they're moderate. They're modest. Well, we haven't been able to pass, we did out of the House, the assault weapon ban. We have to reinstitute the assault weapon ban. Now, California, and I'm going to use this as an example, we have some of the tightest, toughest gun safety measures in the country. But guns come from all over, everywhere. Arizona, Texas, people just bring them on in. And so we have horrible incidences of gun violence. Unfortunately, sometimes it's black on black crime, school shootings, domestic violence, murders. It's the Wild West in California, and yet we have some of the strongest gun control measures. So we've got to take on the NRA, and people have got to elect members of Congress who are not the supporters of the NRA, because that's where the main problem lies. We've got to close the Charleston loophole. I have a bill on gun tracing. It's hard to trace guns. I think there's a 24-hour period, and that's it. So, there's so many legs to this that we've got to do, but too many, and then ghost guns. Right. Ordering parts of guns online, and in my own community now, ghost guns are the primary the guns that are used to kill people. Order parts online, and then you make the gun. They're totally unregistered, and then you go out and shoot people and kill people with a gun that's not registered, a gun that no one has purchased, so it can't be traced, but that's made, so we need to ban the sale of all of these parts online for ghost guns. So it's so complicated, but I tell you one thing, we've got to get the guns off the streets in this country, and we've got to get the guns. And mental health, yes, is part of the problem, but it's not the problem. It's access to guns. It's access to guns by those who should not have access to them, and it has nothing to do with Second Amendment rights. But the NRA has got a stronghold on those who, just won't allow people to live. I mean, you talk about being pro-life, they aren't.
Right. So now we know that you've been a lifelong supporter of what we call, I do a podcast, and it's called Lady Liberty is Very Pissed. Excuse me for the word. My grandchildren get upset because they're not allowed to say the word, but the very in the title is voting rights, equal rights, and reproductive rights. Yes, all three are definitely at risk. So talk to us a little bit about how we deal with we're stymied with the voting rights bill. The equal rights bill, by the way, 50 years working on it, and you've been working on it for 50 years. And we're sitting here today waiting for a judge in Texas, I believe, to decide whether or not any woman across the country can get
abortion. Yeah. Well, let me say, we've got to understand this in the context of rolling back our democratic rights. These are rights that we have fought for, still for the ERA. And this is a moment where a lot, thanks to that last person in the White House from New York, sorry about that, but that started all of this effort to move away from being a democratic country toward autocracy and autocratic rule. And so you've got to see this in context of the threat to democracy and the threat to our rights. And these three issues are threats to our rights. And you talk about LGBTQ plus rights being rolled back, labor union rights, the right to organize, environmental rights, reproductive justice, voting rights, just continually. So this is a wake-up call. I hope you all understand this. It's not just, these are not just siloed kind of policies. These are big policies that constitute a big deal in terms of our democracy. Do we move forward, or are we going to go backwards?
So you are, and I know we're not going to talk too much about a campaign, but you are running to join the Senate. Only 2 black women have been in that position before. You're so powerful in the House. Talk to us about that transition, we're assuming, when it happens.
It's 2 black women since 1789, serving a total of 10 years. Okay, that's former Senator Carol Moseley Brown and Vice President Kamala Harris. So that's a fact. And so, yes, I have a lot of seniority in the House, but there comes a time when you have to take a risk for a lot of reasons. The voices of first of all, being a black woman with my experience and being able to solve problems, being a progressive black woman, the Senate doesn't have. The Senate needs a lens and a perspective that's not there, period. Black women, when we fight for everybody. I mean, we fight to protect our economy. We fight for our freedom, our democracy. We fight for child care. We fight for LGBTQ rights. We fight for everybody. So, and the way we are, and based on our experience, we have lived lives in an intersectional way. So we see poverty and the lack of affordable child care and people who are unhoused as one big intersection. It all intersects, and our experiences intersect. So the only way we're going to solve this country's problems is we're going to have to look at it in total and figure out how to move forward together. And black women do that all the time. Our history has been about that. And so it's time. It's time. And that's what I'm doing.
It's time, and that's what she's doing. We know that you have to head to the airport shortly, but we have time for 1 or 2 questions?
I have a family member. Why don't you ask a question?
Oh, okay. You have a family? Who's here? Okay.
Yeah, give your name and where and how I know you and all that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right.
What I want to ask is what was asked last night, which is once you are elected to the Senate, what are some of the committees and some of the bills that you want to introduce?
Thank you very much. Nice. And then I have another question since that was mine.
Was that a setup?
Inequality.
That was a setup.
Yeah, that was a setup. No, just inequality in general. And some of the bills, of course, I want to move forward on climate because our young people, we know this is an emergency. And we have to, and I'm working on, have forever on environmental justice issues. So the bill calling for Environmental Justice Act, I would want to move that forward in the Senate. Issues around public safety, every community wants public safety, and we have to raise those voices about what that means for public safety. Housing, again, under inequality, fighting for, you don't hear much Senate debate about how are we going to help the unhoused, how are we going to help the poor, and I said last night, the
Child tax credit.
Child tax credit, that's right. The P word is not used much in the Senate. I had to force it in the House, poverty and peace. And so my agenda will be bills and fighting for poverty and peace, fighting against poverty for peace under the rubric of inequality. And there's a lot under that.
That's terrific. You know, I have so many friends who have said to me, watching what was going on in California recently, environmentally, and saying, what the heck? Snowstorms, et cetera. Talk to us, because that's a personal thing that you...
Oh, yeah, and being raised in El Paso, was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, there was a smelter. I was raised in an immigrant community, and the Arsaco smelter was sited where we are. People my age, my mother, family, friends, all have chronic kinds of lung problems because of that smelter emitting lead and all the other toxic chemicals. And so I come to the environmental movement based on environmental injustices, and also when you look at floods, wildfires, when you look at the Arctic, when you look at everything that's taking place, it's vulnerable communities that are paying the price. And are unfortunately, the impacts are greater. And so I was at COP27 in Egypt last year, and it was interesting because the whole world knew about some of my work, and the people here don't. But one bill that I have that I intend to continue to work on, both in the House and in the Senate, is providing a legislation that requires women in vulnerable communities to be at the table when climate policy is developed. And that's extremely important, extremely important. And secondly, the fossil fuels and what we have done in developing countries, there's such a thing as repairing the damage, and we have a formula now. We finally got the administration to agree to how we move forward on repairing the damage and helping these most impacted countries in the Caribbean and Africa and all over the world, where we've been the polluter and we've been responsible for the terrible climate events that are taking place. And so, yes, climate, I mean, and young people, I'm telling you, they don't see a future because of the climate crisis. And so we need to declare it an emergency, if you ask me, and fight like it is an emergency, because it is.
And what the United Nations just issued, that dire warning, you know, we're on the way out if we don't fix it immediately. Is there one more question? Straight, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, Congresswoman. So we're seeing a flood of anti-LGBTIQ and in particular anti-trans laws across the country. And I know that this is an issue that you've prioritized as a founding member and the vice chair of the Equality Caucus. Can you tell me what legislative efforts you're a part of to protect LGBTIQ lives and in particular trans lives? And what other action do you think needs to be taken?
Well, there's several bills, and I don't have them handy right now, but several bills around the transgender community that address the unfortunate crimes and the hate and protections of transgender communities, which is one thing we've got to deal with right now. Secondly, making sure the trans community is included in all of our Equality Act bills or our equality legislation, including the language, not just LGBTQ, but LGBTQ plus and trans. So the way right now that I'm addressing it is because of the hate and the killings and all of the terrible things that are taking place, is trying to get people, especially in communities of color, unified around a movement that addresses hate and the trans community, because a lot of folks are uninformed. And so using my megaphone now and in the Senate is a big megaphone in the Senate to use. But basically, and I can get you the names of the bills, but we have several bills. And I was the first vice chair when Barney Frank started the Equality Caucus. He asked me to be a vice chair of the Equality Caucus because he needed me, and I'm glad I did, to help bring more people to an understanding of what homophobia means and what non-discrimination means against anybody and what marriage equality means. So I've done a lot of work just in that space to try to bring, and we've done pretty well, more people around who weren't quite there yet.
Great, and thank you for all of that work. Thank you so much. But I just think Gillian has.
Okay. And then
Right. Okay. Great.
Then I'm gonna have to.
Right. We know.
I think I was just asked to give a closing word to say first, Congressman, thank you beyond words for such an impressive and important and life-changing career. You really are an inspiration to all of us, including the young students here, who should be thinking, yes, I can do that, or I can try. So as you say all the issues that you have supported, I just keep saying to myself, yes, right. And I know that my late husband, Ted, would also be respectful and proud and grateful for all that you have done. So from my heart, thank you to you and also to Carol Jenkins for moderating.
Thank you, Julie. You inspire me. These are moments that keep me going. So thank you very much. And one more question here.
Congresswoman Lee, thank you. You're my big sister in my head. But I'm Director of Financial Aid for CUNY School of Law. And I wanted to ask your take on the public interest loan forgiveness piece and how you could encourage my friend, the president, to really work on, I know you wanted me to ask the question, changing the policies in a good way to help support our students, especially students in the inner city.
We're working, I think on student loan debt forgiveness, 20,000, we tried to get it to 50,000. Now you see what the courts have done, even on 20,000. So it's a process. But also, I believe this is what I believe that we should have for many students, debt-free college education, okay? And I want the president to get there to be able to say that, too.
I have to say, though, I'm thankful for a lot of the policy changes that have been implemented. It's the first time that I can hear from my students that their loans are forgiven, because when our other friend was in office, there was a hiccup, and there was only like 96 students that loans were discharged. So thank you.
Thank you. No. And like I say, I think this administration is pushing the envelope, but it's up to Congress to push it even more, and that's what we're doing.
So thank you for your work.
Congresswoman Lee, thank you so much for being with us. Okay.
Enjoyed it, and really good to be here with everyone, and we'll come back to spend more time.